Awesome. Thank you for being here. If you could make sure you're muted, communication will be online through Slido. We'll get into that, but welcome. Uh, this is a webinar on organizational change for inclusion, diversity, and equity. This is kind of like a part two, the webinar that we did in December, talking about cultural intelligence and DEI work. Will really speak into um, the framework, part of the framework in theory. Um, and let's get started. I know a few more people are coming in, but some housekeeping. The agenda is we'll do some introductions in a second, and then we'll have three sections to today's training. First section is about organizational models. Second section is about how do you assess an organization in inclusion and diversity, and then how do you start to change an organization. We'll end with some questions and dialogue. Please make sure you're logged into slido.com and use this code. That's what we're gonna use for all of your questions, and know that we will not get to all the questions. However, we will use the questions we don't get to create further 15 to 20 minute answers and training that'll be free. So yeah, Jen Mote, could you introduce yourself?
Good morning or afternoon, everybody. My name is Jennifer Mote, and Pablo and I have been working together in the DEI space for over 6-7 years together, collaborating on training and development. My background is in human resources. I have over 20 years of experience working for Fortune 50 and high-tech organizations. Over the last 7 years, I transitioned into a lot of leadership coaching, executive coaching, and coming alongside leaders in the nonprofit space, really wanting to drive culture change and transformation for organizations. So my background has primarily been in hiring talent and developing really high-functioning teams, and then creating culture transformation in DEI spaces.
Awesome.
And Pablo, do you want to
talk
about?
Yeah. So my name is Pablo Otaola. I am 2 months away from finishing my doctorate in inclusion, diversity, and organizational change. So I'm pretty excited about that. I've been in this work since before it was called inclusion, belonging, any of that, when it was just called urban or multicultural. And that has been since 2002, been working in different organizations. Before that, I live and breathe this, which is why it's so personal. I'm an immigrant, racial minority, even though I'm white presenting. And I'm in a cross-racial, cross-gender, cross-cultural marriage within a bilingual home. So I live and breathe it, and then kind of made it my job. So now I run Thriving Culture as a CEO, consulting firm, and involved with EIDA Center, which is the certifications on inclusion and diversity and training series. So yeah, thank you so much for being here again. Please log into Slido. I'll be checking questions. And even if you need, we will not be checking the chat. So even if you need to contact me personally, just put it in the Slido as a thing, like we can't hear you or something like that. So let's get started. So I will briefly go into this because it's in our other video that's free on our YouTube channel. And that is that we base all of our theoretical framework on cultural intelligence, which is the science and theory. It's the theory of how capable people and organizations are in being cross-culturally competent, whether that's leadership, personally, what knowledge do you have? You'll see here on the left, what knowledge do you have? Are you motivated towards it? Do you just live it out subconsciously? and can you create strategy around it, pre-checking and post-checking how things went. And then on the right over here, which we'll talk a lot about today, a little bit later, is how that science and theory can go into an organizational level. How competent is an organization through its processes, structures, and leadership? How competent are they going to be to engage cross-cultural engagement in the organization and outside of it? One last thing, this webinar is not for you to know all the nitty-gritty details of what to do exactly. This is more of an instructional, what do you need to know in general and what work will you need to know after. So it sets the foundation for you to leave with some action steps, but you'll not be able to this afternoon or later this evening come up with an organizational plan that will be perfect. So take some pressure off yourself and know that one, you'll have this recording, you'll have the PowerPoint so you don't have to take pictures of the screen every time, but also know that this is the beginning of a journey. So Jen, I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent, thank you. So where we want to start our journey is just letting you start to think through like the development of your own organizational systems and giving you a framework and some guideposts for how you think through your organization and the places where you want to impact change. And when you're assessing and analyzing your own organization, it'll give you some buckets to think through where have we been highly effective and where have we still been fuzzy and where are there places that we really have to make some profound change. So at a very high level, when you're zooming out and looking at your organization, we can go to the next slide, Pablo. I think it's just really helpful to understand where do you work? And I know that sounds like simple, but really there are so many things that impact the organization and the system and structures based on your industry silo. So for example, if you're in healthcare, everything that you're doing has to be through the lens of HIPAA, like protecting patient information, thinking through the best in science. It also has a lot of impact on quality and quality measures. And so when you're thinking about, you know, the world of work, understanding what is particular to you in a healthcare industry is going to be different than, let's say, you're in manufacturing and you're creating large airplanes. And let's say you're with a Boeing, for example, then you need to understand Six Sigma and quality measures. So all those things impact and shape the culture from the outside in. And there's just high levels of standards and protocols that you need to be mindful when it comes to understanding your industry. And if you've switched industries, not everything that you had in place in one organization is going to be in place in a new one based on how much they've had to think about or focus on community relations or quality. So you might bring a special bend to a new organization if you're in a new industry that didn't maybe tap into all the expertise you had before. So I just think that's a really helpful thing to think about when you're thinking about organizations overall. So let's go to the next slide. And this is where it gets to be a lot of fun. So if you like to geek out on change theory and really thinking about organization and structures, this is a slide that I would recommend that you refer back to time and time again when you're reflecting on the journey you want to take your organization through. Because not only are you thinking about those external things that I was mentioning, but there's also this incredible interplay of these really broad sweeping government ordinances, high quality, like I said, healthcare stuff. And then you also have the individual, right? And what the individual is seeking as far as meaning and purpose and aligning their meaning and purpose with your organization's meaning and purpose. And how well do they feel like they belong and are seen in the organization? But for those of you working at organizational change, that strategic line is really an important place to kind of embed yourself in the beginning to understand what is the strategy and the mission of our organization, and have we woven DEI even into that mission? From there, it's also going to be really important to be thinking about what leadership styles and what kind of leadership principles are driving your organization. Have you had clarity on that? Are those principles written down? Are they accessible? Do you have documentation of those things? And then also when it comes to the culture overall, I think this is where it gets really intriguing, because even if you have a lot of things that are spelled out well strategically in your mission, you have leadership principles, a lot of things make or break on the culture. And what I want to have you think about that is like, we have things that are explicit in our cultures and we have things that are implicit in our cultures. And so we have these rules that are written, and then we have the unwritten rules. And if you want to get a better frame of reference for that, I think it's fun to go back to high school and to think about what was it like as an individual to be in a classroom, right? You had the rules of the classroom, but then 3 weeks in, you kind of knew the unwritten rules of the classroom. You knew how to get to the teacher. You knew if he would let or she would let you turn in an assignment late, or how long would they let you turn in an assignment late. And so you kind of learned like the wiggle in the reel and how things really got done. And that can build some complacency, or that can build a high level of excellence, depending on how well they are coherent with what they say they expect and hold into accountability. So I think there's a lot that you need to be thinking about as leaders. Where's that play in the wheel, and where maybe have we given pass to things that we shouldn't be giving pass to, even though they're written in our laws, you know, in our strategic mission and in our leadership principles. And then let's go to the next slide too. So you can see already there's a great deal of complexity as we hold kind of just organizational structure in place. But then if you look at the individual, you can see that an individual is constantly doing a dance within themselves, and then also within their micro and macro culture and environment. So, you know, things get shaped both ways, and there's generational differences on the approach to work. There's how threats are perceived, how status is perceived in the world of work. And so you can make an announcement to your general body, but I mean, statistically, you're going to know there's going to be some individuals who are very excited, enthusiastic about the change that you're bringing, and there's going to be a percentage of people that are resistant to that change. And so just thinking through that, even the best plan that you feel like is empathetically motivated and driven is going to have resistance to it. And then you need to be thinking through, how do we bring people along with us on this journey in a way that they have full buy-in. But these kind of different levels are the big buckets that you need to have in mind as you're going throughout organizational change. And you can see the complexities in place. So next slide, Pablo. So we just want to give you a moment to just reflect on this. How does this information line up with what you're experiencing in your own organization? Right? Like, as you've been thinking about DEI and maybe where some of the soft spots are still in your organization, or as you're reflecting on past initiatives and how well they were adopted and received, you know, what comes to mind as you reflect on this? And what questions do you still have? So we're going to give you a couple of minutes just to put pen to paper or to reflect, and then start you know, putting the questions that you have into Slido.
Also, maybe you don't have a question, you could, or reflection, you can also vote up the questions. The questions that we will engage are the ones with the most votes at the top. Just another minute. So there is a question. I love this diagram. So we'll go back.
Yeah.
So this diagram is Burke Litwin, B-U-R-K-E, Litwin, L-I-T-W-I-N model. If you just Google Burke Litwin model, you will get a lot of information. You will find this diagram as well. There's a really good blog there. We'll send it with a follow-up. If you were talking about this diagram, that's where you can find it, Burke-Litwin model. This diagram at the very top, Brofenbrenner, that's the theoretical model. The other piece, and that'll talk about the individual as they grow up, et cetera. But the inclusion diversity overlay is actually some of the work that we've been able to do with Thriving Culture, where this model is used within an organization. And you'll find a lot of Brofenbrenner and organization. However, the inclusion diversity piece is what you'll see on here, especially as it relates to organizational CQ. And you actually won't find too much of inclusion diversity within organizational change. You will find more around the experience of the racial minority, the experience of a social minority, if you're looking for resources there. Again, we'll attach some resources for you. So here's a question, Jen, if you can engage it. Can you give an example of a way to engage employees in this work?
There's a couple of different ways that I've seen organization engage this work, and I think there's two ways that it's important. It's always helpful to feed people's cognitive functioning. So hitting people with facts is really, really helpful, and it's very, very grounding, and it helps to mediate some of the threat of change. So whenever we engage clients, there's an incredible amount of research that shows that when you drive belonging, when you do the integrative work of having a diverse leadership team and a diverse culture that's shaping work culture, supply chain, how you read and know your customer base. Every piece of research shows that when you have a multi-ethnic, gender diverse, sexuality diverse team, then you outperform your competition because you have a much broader scan of your industry. You have fewer blind spots because everybody's lens of perspective is being brought to the table and is being viewed as equally important and a strong consideration. So when you show people that the end game is a really much more unified, strong, cohesive, competitive, if you're worried about market share solution, I think that's very intrinsically motivating for people. And it gets them through the more emotional threat piece of this, which is, oh my goodness, is my status going to change because of this? How promotable am I now? Will I get that promotion? I've had to leave so much of myself behind at the workplace. I haven't felt like I can talk about social issues or speak into these things. If you say the written word rule now is that I can bring up my frustration and my anger when I'm seeing things on the political scale, or if I can bring up my frustration and anger when I watch somebody get brutally murdered. These conversations, you know, you're permissioning them for the workplace, but are you really? Is there going to be a silent way that I'm going to pay for that on the back end, or am I going to be centered in that and valued and appreciated? And so while you're transitioning people, you have to understand that you're in people's narratives and you're in people's fight, flight, or freeze, and people are only going to risk so much as they think it's going to be rewarded. And so there is a very strong interpersonal path to this. There's a lot of assessment that can be done, employee resource groups. So that's why I think it's a both and that's why you really need an expert guide, because you can't just run one rail of this solution and think you're going to have a viable solution. It will blow up. If you go all cognitive, you're going to leave the heart piece behind, and you won't have like an emotionally mature organization. If you go all emotion, and you don't have a trauma-informed lens for caring for people through this process, then you leave the cognition behind, which is what helps you to stay in your frontal lobe, do executive functioning, and deliver on the profitability that you want for your organization. So it's really that both and that's why you need a guide.
Thanks, Jen. Got another great question. We're in the midst of trying to assess our cultural intelligence. We keep getting sidetracked with crisis and COVID planning, but that's no excuse. I replied on there. We did talk about that last month in our other webinar. And so I suggest you look there if you're interested in that. And also we'll get into that a little bit here, but COVID is showing that marginalized people groups get more marginalized if we don't have an inclusive, equitable lens into our diversity. So, yeah, it's during crisis, it's more important because more people are going into fight, flight, freeze, and they're not, they're overseeing naturally through their own bias, etc. They're overseeing the most vulnerable people group in your organization, primarily racial minorities, women, part-time staff, etc. So we're gonna keep moving.
Pablo, before I jump in, I think the thing that's really important to understand is that this change is not an event and a destination. You're in a change process. And so when COVID believe me, I understand these COVID, we're dealing with it right now within our own organization where we have employees who are, suffering with the illness right now. And so you're pivoting and you're shifting all the time and you're under resourced because people are home or people are trying to school with their kids at home. I mean, there's just all sorts of chaos right now. So I think if people think that change is going to be clean and tidy, I think that's a big thing to set back and reframe to say, we are in a change process and we are going to celebrate all the small wins along the way. Sometimes if people think the DEI work is this big cannonball that's going to go out and it needs this cannonball investment, I agree. I think from an emotional perspective, I am wholeheartedly behind that. This needs momentum and it needs change, and everything in our systems and our culture is crying out for it. And an organization can only metabolize so much at once. So what are the most effective bullets that you want to shoot out into the organization that's going to bring lasting change and is going to keep your flywheel moving? It may not be a rushing waterfall, but you can't let up, but you could have multiple streams of change happening at the same time. You could be adapting to COVID at the same time that you're driving DEI change. It doesn't have to be an either or, but you have to acknowledge that you're in a change process, which is incredibly disorienting. And when people are in threat, they want to pump the brakes and freeze, like Pablo was saying, but you just say, let's not freeze. Let's keep going in a bullet fashion so that we can all do this in a healthy way.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jen. The second part of our time today is about, okay, so now you know kind of how to think through systems in your organization according to your sector, et cetera. But then, we usually go straight to training. We usually go straight to let's talk, let's have a dialogue. But we don't know the cultural competence of the people having the dialogue, and we usually don't have a culturally competent framework to look at your systems or a tool. We usually actually, I've been reading organizations do their own tool, and it's not even research-based, which becomes culturally biased. So talk a little bit about how to look at the system. And of course, we're going to use cultural intelligence. And I'm not going to go into it again. You can go into the December training. What I will say is a little bit more about these three components. Managerial or leadership CQ is the actual cultural competence, cross-cultural competence of organizational leaders, because organizational leaders, primarily the CEO, if you look at who they are, their strengths finders, their Enneagram, are they anxious or depressed? Are they entrepreneurial or not? who they are as a leadership team shapes the culture of the organization. If it's an all white, low cultural competence, or all black, low or high cultural competence team, their cultural values will shape the processes and the structures of the organization. And then you have to engage the processes and structures of the organization to see if there's any structural things that are getting in the way of being inclusive and equitable and sustaining diversity, as well as you got to look at the processes. Is time elastic or not? Is it high or low power and differential? I say what I say goes versus no, this is a collaborative sharing space, and it's not right or wrong. It is preference, and there's pros and cons. So whatever tool you use or your organization uses, it has got to absolutely measure the cultural competence of leaders, especially the top, processes, what cultural bias is there, and structures, specifically as it gets into power, because structures are ceilings and boundaries that could be good or could be unhealthy. So you have to use some sort of theoretical framework that measures different things. The one that Thriving Culture uses is an eight-factor model that is culturally intelligent based. So here are the 8 things that it measures. Leadership behavior, the actual CQ of leaders at the organizational level. So this is for the whole organization is the idea. If you don't look at if we don't all look at our own organizations as a whole and change it as a whole, then even if we start to change silos, at some point it becomes, they hit a ceiling because of the structures and processes that they cannot change because they're not HR or some sort of leader that's over a division or a state or anything like that. So the leadership behavior perspective from entry-level employees, mid-level employees, et cetera, towards upper management, upper leadership, that needs to be assessed, because perception is reality. It impacts people, it impacts how they feel like they belong, et cetera. The organizational adaptability, if we even go back to how, well, we could talk practically about last year, politically, and this year and this month, is the organization talking about being adaptable to culture internally and externally? Do employees feel that and see that the organizational structures and processes and the management styles are changing? Are they adaptable? Is it intentional? Meaning it's something that our culture just talks about. We talk about normal things, and normal things is what time is lunch? When is the Christmas party? And did you see what happened on the news with that racial minority in our city? Is there an intentionality? And is it also visual? Is there intentionality in every part of your organization? Marketing, recruitment, are you vulnerable and transparent in how you put your stats online? Because it does engage and impact recruitment and retention. Training and development, of course. And again, this is one that we usually just go straight from leadership behavior to training and development and say, let's just train people. But what research actually shows is training is not sustainable, because this is very personal work that talks about how people feel and who people are and how that is embedded into systems, processes, and leadership. So training and development needs to be ongoing, and it cannot be only, even though it is required. We do need to have our subconscious bias training. We do need to have our yearly legal training and diversity, but also the development of people. Is there a pipeline that takes employees from entry level to potentially being the next CEO? Is there mentorship? Is there cross-racial management training? Is there a women employee resource group that is strictly used to understand who your talent is? There's a lot to do in training and development, but it is only one of the bubbles. Inclusion is, do people feel included in this whole process? Do they feel, because they either feel included or excluded. That's how our minds work. It's in group or out group. It's not in a scale. How included do you feel, even though that's how you do survey tools? Our brains are in group or out group. Am I in or out? And most of the time, unless there is that organizational intentionality and adaptability, unless there is that high CQ leadership, most people that are not white, male, straight, middle upper class, etc., which is most of leadership positions in organizations, people are not going to feel included. So it's a really good measure to get to. That inclusion overlaps with a sense of belonging. There are different questions, different metrics, different research, but a sense of belonging directly impacts how much somebody is going to produce in an organization. Racial minorities, women, people that grew up poor or some sort of hard situation, they're going to grind regardless of sense of belonging. But how much more will you get out of an employee when they feel like they're thriving because they feel like they belong? They see their culture represented not just on January 18th MLK Day, but they see it throughout the whole year. It's not Latinx month, 1 month. It is all the time, and the questions are consistent, and the inclusive process is consistent. So that's another thing that needs to be measured, and that we do measure. And here's one that I'm pretty excited about that I have not seen overlap with this work. I'm sure it's out there. I just haven't seen it in the last couple of years of research. I'm sure people are thinking about it, but I have not seen it in a tool, and that's employee intent to leave. So within the way we assess, and the way I believe we all need to assess, we need to know where people are at, not just sense of belonging, because then we start guessing, oh, okay, the sense of belonging is low. And we probably have 4 to 6 months of leeway here. Employee intent to leave is very specific intentionality on people actually thinking about leaving, people actually taking action steps to put their resume together, people actually taking action steps to look for jobs and go on interviews. And of course, this is a hard metric to get, but when you have psychological safety through anonymity and people from outside of your organization asking these questions, you are going to get some good data that will drive the urgency of the work. So one of the questions it was, we're in the midst of trying to assess our CQ. We keep getting sidetracked with crisis and COVID planning. If we had this metric of racial minorities, for example, their intent to leave was high because we were measuring that Q1 2020, then all of a sudden, this wouldn't have been, I would assume, this wouldn't have been an issue, because we would have had the urgency that now that we have COVID, people are already thinking, people already have a low sense of belonging. We have to actually double down on this work now instead of leave it as number 2 or possibly later. Then as far as the structure and processes, there's a lot of documentation that needs to be assessed. Do you have it or not? And if you do have the right documentation, what's the quality of it? Because again, who wrote it? What team wrote it? Was it diverse? Did they have high or low CQ? Who was not represented in the room where those documents were written? So the assessment needs to be completely holistic in order to be able to get really good data to form metrics and goals of how to develop your organization. So at this point, I'm gonna move on to the actual process of assessing the organization, but it is a little bit of a transition. So if you're starting to think about questions about this model specifically, something that we're missing because we have our own bias, go ahead and start jotting it down, whether it's in Slido or here, specifically if it's in Slido, because we'll be able to engage people's questions in a moment. So again, DEI work or EIDA work is the whole organization or bust. Because here's what happens. People like to talk about the ground up process, and that's needed, but without a top down that changes the whole organization, people start to become more culturally aware. They start to creating better inclusive microcultures, but when they hit a ceiling what is that going to do when they've spent blood, sweat, equity, etc., time, money, and all of a sudden there's organizational limits, organizational ceilings? There's going to be frustration. And so the research shows that within 3 years of microcultures changing, there's usually either a revolt or organizational change. And what happens over time, as I'm sure you can tell in our country, is that sure, things get a little better, but there's no real models of organizations doing it really well holistically. You'll get lists of people that are doing it well. In the HR sense, we're tracking data well, we're doing some surveys, etc. But when you actually get to the qualitative narrative of how do you feel, and you start talking to racial minorities and women, and you start asking them questions they've never thought about, usually the situation is more dire or not as good as people assume. So we need to get away from tracking just diversity, but tracking inclusion and equity and accessibility really well. So regardless of it being a everything or bust, you can actually use this model within a subculture in any organization, any sector, any office, any state, etc. Just know the leadership ethics piece here is that while you build microcultures, there needs to be a all-encompassing strategy of how to include the CEO, the executive director, etc. And here's the process of development. So once you have the framework, once you have a team, once you have the opportunity, you have to get the data. And the data is quantitative or surveys, numbers, qualitative, which is narrative, focus groups, and you have to have document analysis, like I said earlier. Then most people want to go from step 1 to step 3. Let's do a plan. That can happen, but there needs to be an assessment of do people have inclusive and equitable frameworks so that their opinion is actually informed. If not, then that's where a lot of damage happens, especially in Western culture where our need for development is super quick versus Asian culture where there's 100-year strategic plans. And we could say, whoa, that's too long. Well, no, that's our cultural preference in the West. We actually need this work to be sustainable. Otherwise, we're wasting money, we're traumatizing people, we're hurting people in the way, and then we just reiterate the idea that, see, this isn't going to work. So there needs to be training on inclusive and equitable frameworks before people start to do strategic planning. With this work specifically, an outside consultant is crucial because there's organizational bias as well. People from within the organization, they're gonna be subconsciously thinking about, is my job on the line? Do I have enough power to say this? What is a threat to me, my job, my family, my survival, honestly? So an outside consultant that could come in and just say, this is just what the data says, this is what the research says, and yeah, let's work together, even though this might hurt a little bit or might be hard to hear. But eventually you get to create a plan. That plan absolutely needs to start with, and I'll go back to it right up here, the strategy and mission. This needs to change. If your strategy or mission doesn't say we are centering the furthest, something like this, we are centering the furthest out as we pursue this and that, majority cultural bias is going to take over. And once we change the strategy and mission, then we can start to change the organizational culture because the direction changed. Sure, we're going to sell computers, but we're going to sell it this way. And if we sell less computers Q1 and 2 so that we can sell way more the following year because our diversity is thriving, then we're going to do that. But we have to change the strategy and mission, which will change the urgency of the organization. Then after that, all that internal work is done. We get to step 4, where we get to train everybody. It's going to be awareness. It's going to be training that increases motivation, like cultural intelligence seeks to change. And then they get to start living something else out It is a learning modality, human learning modality, where you don't know what you don't know. Then you realize because you didn't know, you're not competent in something you haven't practiced. So you need some training to get competent, some practice opportunity. Eventually, in 2, 3, 4 years, depending on where the organization's at, people will be able to start to feel confident subconsciously just living in this new type of space that is inclusive and diverse. Once you do that, once you start training everybody, you can continue to go, or once that starts, you can start the change management phase 2, which is mostly coaching and training. So here's some reflection for you all, and if you can engage with Slido again. How would this model be helpful in your organization? How would it retain minority people groups, and really think about why? And how would it motivate your employees? So think about that for a second, really contextualize it to your own organization. Maybe your heart's beating faster because you're excited. Maybe your heart's beating faster because you feel threatened or overwhelmed. I don't know. But engage your own emotions, engage the emotions of somebody that pops into your mind or a people group, and take some notes, and then we would love to answer some questions. I know that was a lot of information too, which is why we record it, and maybe you feel overwhelmed, and that's what I feel all the time, and this is my full-time job. So this is a big job, big work, and it's complex, which is why we get to work with experts and we get to work with teams that have learned this. Jen, while they are reflecting and thinking, is there anything you would like to add or highlight?
I mean, there's just so many great thoughts, Pablo. I was taking my own notes even as you were talking. And I think a lot about that psychological safety element. And I think as leaders of these initiatives, you have to think about your own sustainability in this work too. So I thought about how you're talking about how your heart pumps in your chest and stuff. And so none of you woke up this morning saying, I want to be a DEI expert, right? Like you were called to the field, into the industry, into the work, into the body of work that you're in, and you're wanting to make more just, equitable cultures along the way. So you, in a strange way, this is almost like a side job to your job, and yet it's your core passion, and you know it's going to change and revolutionize your organization, which is just going to be a more fuller expression of you and others that you're working with, which is stunning work to have. I think a lot about just how do you protect your own self and your own heart from burnout in this work, because you will meet incredible milestones and have high highs, and you will also meet incredible resistance and bias and racism and the muck of the human condition. And so I just think a lot about, for people, like how are they equipping their own hearts for this journey?
Yeah, that's a good point, Jen. Since questions aren't coming in, which is totally fine, I think one of the things that I've really put my finger on is the difference between a DEI expert and an inclusive, equitable leader. We all should strive to be inclusive, equitable humans, inclusive, equitable employees, inclusive, equitable leaders. And whatever motivates you, right? Like, you're gonna be able to retain diverse teams, train them up, lead them better, which will be more productive. So that's a business motivation. There's also the human motivation of trauma informed, and the impact on humans, and how we can literally be a healing presence to people that are just colleagues now and could be friends later, just because we now engage differently. And there's also, if those two don't motivate you, there's also the legal piece. If we're inclusive, equitable leaders, guaranteed that if we're ever sued, you will have done everything right. You will have thought and centered about a person, and that will actually save the organization money, time, effort. It'll be about people as well. So those three motivating factors, and the difference between inclusive, equitable leaders, and DEI experts, which are, the full-time, not part-time, the full-time DEI lead for an organization. With maybe that's when you have a couple part-time staff or a couple people that are full-time in the organization but spend some part-time. So there's the experts, and there's the inclusive, equitable leaders. Yeah, keep on putting Slido questions up there, or thoughts. Even reflections are great, because we can learn from each other. And we'll move on. We'll move on to the next thing. So Jen, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. So I know how I feel when I'm in these places where I feel like I'm drinking from a fire hose. And so, we realize that this is a lot of data to take in, and it also, hits your own passion centers for what you want to see changed. It also impacts just maybe your own frustration, and maybe it maybe even kind of jangles some of the places where you've thought about putting together your own resume. Like, do I have the resilience to do this as a leader myself? And so just give yourself a ton of grace for this, and know that this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And we're here to help you to segment out this work, and to have the big, hairy goals in mind, but then also to break it out into manageable pieces for yourself. So organizational change is just a really incredible body of work, and especially in the field of DEI. Like I said, you're kind of in the soul of an organization and the soul of your employees when you're in this work. So let's go to the next slide. So I just want you to think about this. Think about your own ability to bring change, to bring your own change about. Think about a time when an organization mandated or handed a change to you that you accepted. And we could even, let's get this out of DEI categories. Let's think about, like, have you ever worked for an organization that changed an accounting system, for example? Have you ever worked in an organization that was not digital, everything was manual, and then all of a sudden everything went online? Or have you ever worked for an organization that didn't have any social media and nothing, there was no social recognition, and all of a sudden they were adopting and asking you to be much more social in your handles and how you were engaging social media in the world and your cause? So I just want you to think about a time when change was something that you had to adopt, and think about what went well in that change process. And reflecting on 2020, a year of change, right? Like, and we're still in it. Think about a change that you resisted, right? That was thrust upon you. You had to adopt, but you weren't an early adopter of it, but you resisted it. A change process was brought to you, and you resisted that change. And just kind of noodle on. I think I would really write these two questions out for yourself, and just think about this from time to time. Take out this note on your phone, or if you're more of a sticky note person, just, I think it's a really powerful thing to know about yourself, is to know, how do you handle change, and what motivates you to be in with change or a resistor of change. And we'll go to the next slide. Because your organization is filled with a bunch of people who are right in that bullseye of saying, okay, you're bringing change. Am I going to be an adopter of that change, or am I going to be a resistor of that change? And then you get into, like, the human psychology of threat and reward. And you have to be thinking through your HR solution. So this has always been my wheelhouse has always been thinking through how can we best hire people into our organization that are intrinsically interested and motivated to embody what it is that we're asking to bring about. Because the more people you can get involved in the change, especially in the beginning, who are intrinsically motivated to wanting to be early adopters, you don't have to coerce these people. You don't have to threaten these people. You don't have to manipulate the reward centers. You are just inviting them to something that's a fuller expression of themselves. But here's the danger, and this is something that's really important to understand. If you take someone who is intrinsically motivated and then you start to give them extrinsic rewards, for example, you start bonusing people who are already intrinsically motivated to do it, you actually diminish the intrinsic motivation. When you start to bonus people, when you bring an external reward to something that was already intrinsically motivated, you actually start to reduce the level of intrinsic reward. And you need a lot of intrinsic reward when it comes to this body of work. And so I just think it's really important to be aware of like the psychology of motivation and the psychology of change at the interpersonal level. And so this is just another wrinkle to be thinking about. And what's nice is if you know people's CQ data, you know what their drive is. That's one of the quadrants of being in CQ work is what is a person's CQ drive? Like, are they curious about this? Do they find it fascinating? Do they want to learn about other people and other cultures? Do they like to perspective shift and see things from other people's lenses? If they're intrinsically driven in that way, those are some of the people you want to get brainstorming and ideating around how you want to change your culture. Because what we do know is if you start throwing out a bunch of mandates out, the unwritten rules of that culture are going to revolt, and you will actually get more damage, like Pablo was saying, than positive impact. That's that. I love that research that you brought to the table, Pablo, saying that microcultures have 3 years. And then if the larger organization doesn't change, then there's people leave, like they vote with their feet, or there's a real frustration. There's a vote with, pressure change, culture change. It reminds me of a similar research, but not exactly, saying that people join great organizations, but they leave bad managers.
Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting to have both of those together and juxtaposed.
Or they leave great managers that have low CQ.
Yeah.
Low cultural competence. Because
Yep.
a lot of times, most of the work that we have to do is equipping majority white male leaders that have been promoted for whatever reason, but they're in managerial positions. And then you have entry level people that are racial minorities, or, there's this cascading up of cross-racial management dynamics. And then all of a sudden 2020 happens, 2016 politically happens, etc., and it's more in your face. And we have a lot of people that are ill-equipped to, there's nothing written on when political conversations according to race happen and it's a cross-racial conversation. Here are some things to keep in mind, and we'll also train you for 3 days on this. Those resources are not there. So I agree with what you're saying, Jen.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
So let's get really practical. So I'm going to do about 2.5 years of my doctorate in 5 minutes. How about that?
Oh my God.
All right, so let's go into the actual change process. There's a lot of different people and processes of change. I personally have enjoyed, and it's part of my dissertation, Cotter's 8-step process, because it layers really well with everything we just talked about. So here are the 8 steps, and they start with creating a sense of urgency. So generally, Yeah, absolutely. We want to change. We want to create a sense of urgency. We want to inspire people. Let's do this, right? But what happens is when you start talking about race and inclusion diversity, all of a sudden, what was really easy to give everybody, bonuses now from now on, when we don't think about race, when we don't think about how structure has affected gender and those dynamics, then all of a sudden we are not even asking the right questions. How are we creating a sense of urgency for white people to do this? How are we creating a sense of urgency for young people to do this? How are we creating a surge of urgency for immigrants that have an accent and don't feel like they're part of the culture to want to do this and engage with this? Because when we take race and gender and DEI metrics into context, everybody is motivated by a different thing because different spaces have hurt people, different spaces have been good experiences, and it just becomes pretty complex. So I'm not going to go into, also FYI, I'm not going to go into all of these. These are just questions that further show you what to think about and how DEI complicates this, or how it makes it more, it shows it to be more complex. So that's for you in the PowerPoint, but I'm just generally going to talk through this process. Also, this Cotter's 8 steps, you'll see on the bottom left right here, this is where you can actually read a lot about this for free. So it's there for you in the slides. Next, you got to build a guiding coalition, and it's not just anybody, but now you're talking about a diverse team, not just race, but gender, sexuality, age, positionality, authority. There's so many different components. A lot of organizations are not tracking sexual orientation or diverse ability, and it's already there, but people aren't tracking it, and then they have a hard time approaching the conversation of asking somebody if they have a specific need in learning, etc. But if we actually tracked it and did it well, we would increase how long people stay in our organizations. So regardless, you have to build a guiding coalition, a team, a task force. We call that phase 2 in thriving culture. We gather the data and then build a guiding coalition born of its own ranks, people that know the culture, regardless of me being an expert on the theory and our teams being expert on our own social identities and experiences. We don't know your context. We don't know the intricacies of your context. We can get some data, but we need a people group born of their own ranks to guide this work long term. Then we form a strategic vision and initiatives. We write it down. We have a task force that works through mission, vision, values, the processes, policies. We start to create a DEI workbook, a DEI manual, so that when you do have those cross-racial managerial situations, it's not a phone call to an HR that has never been trained on race. It is actually the HR department showing you the manual you were trained on earlier that year, reminding you of it and walking alongside you in something that they've also been trained. But you have a place to go to that talks about recruitment, management, engagement, it's psychological safety tips. But it all begins with a strategic vision. Then you enlist a volunteer army. And that is twofold, right? That is the whole organization, because you're communicating this whole time. This is about all of us. It's not just about some people, it's about all of us. But you also need to have the DEI task forces, specifically employee resource groups that are affinity groups within your organization, and you're consistently getting feedback and you're moving together because you enlisted everyone, because it includes everyone. It's not just this financial audit that we did for the IRS once a year. Then that team enables action, and the executive leadership enables action by removing barriers. We have to consistently be thinking ahead. One of the things with my clients that I've been saying, honestly, all last year is, watch out, we're about to have the elections. These conversations are going to be hard. COVID is going to put some extra hot sauce on it, and it's going to be really hard to talk about. And if we're not thinking and equipping our leaders on how to do it, then all of a sudden people are just going to push that down, and there's going to be explosion. And explosion is going to look like mostly racial minorities exploding according to social context, and managers squashing it instead of inviting it in. And then, like Jennifer said, people are going to vote with their feet. They're going to start leaving. And that wasn't just last year, that's this year. Now we have a change of government. And so there's going to be a lot of emotions tied to that, a lot of thoughts, a lot of people subconsciously reading through comments and microaggressions. So how do we think ahead? How do we, not just me, Pablo, my own self, I'm not even the DEI lead for the organization, but I care. But how does a team of diverse people that represent diverse perspectives, how are we all in our strengths, in our training, in our expertise, thinking about what's coming next on the 19th of this month and next month? So how are we consistently looking forward? Of course, this is an all-encompassing, complex thing that you will never reach because of employee turnover. You will leave the organization at some point. Rare is a person that stays in an organization for 30 years. So you absolutely need to generate short-term wins, be excited about it, measure it, say, look, we did it. We did this thing. We started ERGs. We had the training. We created the budget. We're communicating monthly. Because one thing is, if we're not communicating all these things, short wins or not, then what we are communicating is that it is not important. So that's what racial minorities, people of color, women, people that don't have a high sense of belonging, anything that doesn't feed that need of communication, it will be a detriment, and the communication will be, we don't care, even though we said we did. You might be, as a leader and as an organizational leader, spending a lot of money and time and effort in the background, but it needs to be communicated out. So generate those short-term wins. Then at some point there's a dip, right? Like you get super excited to go on vacation for 3 weeks, and then you are excited driving the 30 hours like Jen just did, and come hour 8, you're just not excited anymore. You're not as motivated, and there's a dip in motivation with organizational change as well. So how do you plan for that? Because that is a barrier. And how do you sustain acceleration? Because different people groups are going to feel different about the process. This is not going fast enough. I'm a racial minority. I lived this my whole life. I've been taught about this since I was 6 years old. And see, here we go. A lot of people that don't speak for me, don't know me, can't speak for me. They're doing the wrong thing. That's one perspective. There's other perspectives of racial minorities or women that are, this is great. And it's not great because they haven't been trained to think from an inclusion and equity lens. So we have to sustain acceleration. We sustain it through wins. We sustain it by thinking cross-racially, cross-gender, etc. Then once you get to this last place, that's when you institute change. Change is once you go through that whole process, once it is sustainable. And that will take 3 years to change culture, because you have to change culture to make it sustainable. But in the process, how do you keep leadership accountable? How do you make quicker organizational leadership changes where now everyone is subject to their performance being measured by how they're leading diversity, by how they're growing in their cultural knowledge? We have to keep thinking about instituting change long-term with culture change and through accountability. Again, I bring up this last thing. This is a learning process with people. This work is incredibly personal because it's about people talking about race without realizing, going and thinking about what mom or dad or their city and culture of their part of the country said about race when they were 6. We don't think about that, but we live out of that when we are talking about race or gender or sexuality. So we have to think, or at least we don't have to think. That's some of my Spanish being translated with high power differential. We have to do this. And you're thinking, I don't have to do anything that you say. It's just a suggestion. So my suggestion is that we think about how this is an organization that has learned something because people brought what they have learned and created systems and structures. So how do you motivate different people that have learned different things, give them the right knowledge for what they have learned to develop them from where they're at, so you can create the right strategy according to people and their stories and what they think and cultural values, so that eventually you not only get people, but organizations to just live out of this new culture that we're trying to create. So we have 10 more minutes. We have gone through a lot. You might already be tired. You might just, I don't know how many people are still on here. You might have turned me off and Jen off a few minutes ago, but we went through systems and a model that you can use to think through your organization. We presented our tool and the kind of dynamics and components that any tool needs to have. And then we talked a little bit more practical about the change process and DEI within it. So here's the reflection question. If your organization did this DEI change process or something similar, think about this. How would racial minorities, women, people in the LGBTQ community feel when they're being communicated about all this, when money's being spent on this, when there's intentionality, time, process, grit and resilience in the process? How would they feel? And what would you do? What would that do to retention? What would that even do to talent acquisition, to hiring? So go ahead and take a moment to think about that. Write up any questions. I see there's a new one on here. Maybe you want to vote that one up. Write up any questions that you might want us to engage. So take a moment, and then we will end in about 10 minutes. And hopefully we can get to some of these questions. Jen, here's one that's been voted up. Maybe you can take it. Do you have any suggestions for how to progress through these models while you are building commitment with top leadership? I'll read it again. Do you have any suggestions for how to progress through these models while you are building commitment with top leadership?
How to progress through the models while you're also building commitment from the leaders.
Right, from top leadership. Yep.
So Pablo, can you go to the red slide, the slide that talks about the executives and then the individual? Because I think it'll be helpful to have people noodle on that. A couple things I would say, and Pablo, I'd love for you to just kind of riff on this with me too, but I would say, you're going to find the people, you're going to find a tribe of individuals who are looking to make change at that microculture level, right? Like, so far it be for me kind of a thing, right? This is how I'm going to lead. I'm going to be intentional. Like if I'm a hiring manager and I have authority on how I promote and who I promote, I'm going to be doing things that are going to change and shift my own microculture. And I'm going to be creating value statements, and I'm going to be making the unwritten rules of my department or my area align with the written rules of what I wish the whole overall organization would be. So I want to kind of eliminate a little bit of that wiggle in the wheel, and I'm going to kind of double down and ask people to share their opinions. So much of being a belonging is a sense that you were heard and that there was mutual respect. When people feel like there is a sharing of power, that goes a real long way. And sometimes power is, I let all voices at the table be heard before I make a decision. And if some of my people have a slower time speaking. Even that is a bias, right? A slower. So I have a strong action orientation. A lot of my strengths are about like ready, fire, aim kind of a thing. Like I go on gut and I don't terribly mull things over. I do, but like there are definitely people who do their best thinking after they've slept on it and then consider things and then maybe 36 hours come back to the table with their best thinking. So I would just say start playing with some of those categories. And then I would also at the same time, so you have the heart of your people that you're leading aligned with you. I would also then go after like more of the cognitive with the leaders. Here's the data. Here's the research. Here's a really interesting article about what Microsoft is doing right now. Here's a really interesting article about what Netflix is doing right now. You know, there's the whole world of work is becoming so multidisciplinary. It's so much fun to get out there and read a couple of blogs or just suggest a podcast, right? Like, listen to this thought leader and what they're doing. And I just think you're tapping into that leader being able to create their own insight, which intrinsically motivates them to do the work. If you're shooting somebody to death, they're not going to be as motivated as if you present them with some material, let it linger a little bit, let them create their own insight, and then circle back around with you to say, gosh, I really want to know more about that. Even just one of these models, you could just say, hey, I'd love to have a dialogue with you on the Connor model. Where do you think we are and what do you think it would take for us to move? And which one of these circles intimidates you and which one do you feel like you could lead out of the gate? And kind of have a coaching conversation with that leader. Those are some of my thoughts. I don't know. What are your thoughts, Pablo?
Yeah, so suggestions for how to progress through these models while you're building commitment with top leadership. So what I would say is, if we're not talking about power from the very beginning, then we are shooting ourselves in the foot, leg, and then the other leg, and we don't even realize it. Because if there's no intentionality in planning for power structures to change, and don't hear me say give the power over to all our entry-level position people that haven't had the gift of time and wisdom, or to say give power to all the immigrant Latinx males, because now all of a sudden there's a immigrant Latinx male bias because they have all the power. That's not inclusion. That is not even diversity. That is perpetuating broken binary models where it's either this group or that group, instead of, no, it's all of us, and it's going to take more work and it's going to be harder. I riffed it on there, and now I'm forgetting suggestions for how to progress through these models. Oh, power. From the beginning, it has to be a top-down organizational change, power modality, power conversation. If leadership doesn't have the right voices, with the right power, with the right amount of budget, with the right amount of expertise, all those things, then it's not going to work. We try to put Band-Aid or gum on the side and kind of stick it in there. But the sustainability of this work, it requires all of it. And what we have seen in the last 20 years is pretty much every attempt, millions and billions of dollars over the last 20 years spent by by Facebook, by Starbucks, by Google. And then 2 to 3 years later, because the right power, the right authority, the right budget, the right expertise were not in the whole model, people leave. Diversity leaders leave. So it's not just a position, because a lot of racial minorities, women, people in the LGBTQ community, oh, you're our person. You are 3 or 5 people. Let us promote you. So do you promote people that don't have the wisdom, the leadership expertise, the cultural knowledge, etc., and they fail. It's a setup for failure. It's good intention, but it's a setup for failure. So talk about power in this process. which means that it can start bottom up, but it needs to quickly be a CEO that is being talked with. So we are out of time. Here is one of the last slides that we have, action steps for you. Is your organization doing this? What would motivate your organization to begin to change? Where do you see your organization in this change diagram? Those are questions for you to process after today. And as you think about a takeaway, consider putting it on Slido, putting more questions because we will engage with that. Consider going to these two websites, which are resources. We have several services that we can help you in wherever you're at, whether you want to be certified in this work because you want to lead it, or on the left, if you want to be coached or developed as an organization. And if you enjoyed today, our next webinar, well, two things. One is we have our previous two webinars on our YouTube channel. And our next webinar will be on trauma-informed inclusion, diversity, and equity. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your questions. It filled up, so we'll have plenty to continue to talk through and do extra 15-minute responses to these questions. Thank you, Jen, for your time as well. Have a great week.